Hi students, in our second video on theory of the firm, we are going to focus in on our cost curves. First, we're going to talk about short-run costs. If you recall in our discussion on production, we focused on two types of inputs. We talked about our fixed inputs and our variable inputs. Now we're going to be looking at our fixed costs and our variable costs. What is the expenditure that occurs in order to acquire the resources necessary for production? Our fixed costs are actually derived from our fixed inputs that we saw in the short run. So the fixed costs arise from the use of fixed inputs. They do not change as our output changes. And an example of this would be that a pizza oven can produce 5 pizzas or 10 pizzas. The cost of one oven is the same either way. And one additional important point about our fixed costs is they have to be paid regardless. So even if I was actually making 0 pizzas, I still have this sunk cost of the pizza oven. I bought the pizza oven either way. It's up to me to now utilize it. This contrasts with our variable costs, which arise from the use of our variable inputs. In this case, they'll vary as output increases or decreases. So our example here will still relate to the production of pizzas, but rather than the oven, which is going to accommodate many different pizzas, in order to make one additional pizza, I need more ingredients such as wheat, such as water, such as cheese. So I have to acquire those variable resources, and they'll contribute to my variable costs. So the important point here is that our variable costs are contingent on the number of pizzas we want to make. If I'm going to make fewer pizzas, I'm not going to buy as many of these ingredients required to make the pizza. I'm still stuck with the pizza oven, but I can reduce the amount of cheese that I'm buying if I'm making fewer pizzas. Or if I now want to expand within my single shop with my one pizza oven, and I can fit more pizzas in the oven, then I'm going to acquire more cheese to make more pizzas. So here we now have a diagram that represents our total costs as well as our total variable costs, and lastly our total fixed costs. What we can note is initially our total fixed costs are unchanged. They're only represented at one cost value, and it remains consistent regardless of the amount of output that we are producing along that horizontal axis. This contrasts with our total variable cost, which is going to be rising as we increase the amount of output that we are producing. Now, both our total variable cost curves and our total cost curves are a little bit unique in that they're not linear throughout. And this is going to relate back to the concept that we looked at with our product curves, that we're going to have diminishing returns from increasing our resources to produce more output. Note that total variable costs are going to be 0 at 0 output, but this is not true actually of our total cost curve. Our total cost curve is going to start at some amount above 0. In other words, we have to pay our fixed costs regardless. So where the fixed cost curve meets our cost axis, the vertical axis, is where the total cost curve begins. We can see that to get our total cost curve, we add the fixed costs to the variable costs at each amount of output, and this gives us that upward shift that gives us a parallel total cost curve relative to the total variable cost curve. So just as we had marginal product when we were looking at our marginal product curves, there was total product, marginal product, and average product, we also have marginal costs. Taking a look at our marginal cost curve, we can see that initially it's going to dip down to a point and then rise up at increasing amounts of output. Definitionally, our marginal costs are the extra cost of producing one more unit of output, which is calculated by considering the change of total cost. Remember, when we talk about marginal, it's about change. Change of total cost resulting from a change in output. So looking back at our marginal cost curve, we can see it's essentially less expensive to get additional output initially. It's still adding to our total costs, but at a sort of decreasing rate. And it's not until we get to that bottom point that now it gets more and more expensive to add additional output. Another important point to consider or to keep in mind is that our changes in marginal cost are entirely associated with our variable cost. Because our fixed costs are unchanging, it stands to reason that any additional costs from new output are only associated with what is variable. The last type of cost that we want to consider are our average costs. These are our costs per unit of output. In other words, cost divided by the number of units per output. So let's take a look at some of the equations which we'll use to calculate these different types of costs. Notice on the left, we have total cost, total variable cost, and total fixed cost. Our total costs are made up of the total fixed cost plus the total variable cost. We could easily rearrange this equation in order to derive out our total variable cost or total fixed cost, depending on the data that is given to us. Our average total cost, similarly, is the combination of our average fixed cost plus our average variable cost. Our marginal costs are going to be the change in the total cost, right? That triangle for change, divided by the change in quantity or the change in the output that's represented on the horizontal axis of our curves. This would also be equal. It's equivalent to, because when we talk about marginal costs, we're only talking about those changes in variable costs, is the change in total variable cost divided by the change in quantity. Here on the right-hand side, we can see the relationship between our product curves and our cost curves, or our marginal cost curve and our average variable cost curve relative to the marginal product and the average product. Note that for the marginal product and the average product, they at first rise and then fall, rise and then fall. For our cost curves, what you might be able to see here is that they are actually a mirror image. Our marginal cost at first falls and then rises. Our average variable cost at first falls and then rises. Note that the marginal cost curve intersects the average variable cost at its minimum, whereas the marginal product curve and the average product curve is going to connect with each other at the maximum of the average product curve. Another important relationship we can see is with this left red line that goes all the way from the marginal product curve down to the marginal cost curve. At the maximum of the marginal product, we have the minimum of the marginal cost. So what can we attribute these mirror shapes to? All of these cost curves and product curves have a similar origin for why they are shaped the way they are, and that is our diminishing marginal returns. This can be explained with our pizza shop. When we add one more unit of labor initially, then we are going to get improved output, potentially even more than double what we had prior, that the marginal product of each additional worker is increasing, which means it stands to reason that the cost of the next unit of output is going to be lower because of that ever-increasing productivity of the workers. But then, at a point, marginal product will begin to decrease, and associated with declining marginal product will be higher costs per unit of output. This is related both on the marginal cost curve as well as on the average cost curve. It gets more expensive to produce additional pizzas. So here is our key idea. When the additional output produced by an extra worker is the most that it can be, then the extra labor cost of producing an additional unit of output is the least that it can be. The greater the marginal productivity, the less cost associated with that increasing amount of output. But once marginal productivity begins to fall, we'll see increasing costs as well. Lastly, we can see in this diagram all of our average cost curves as well as our marginal cost curve. We can see how they relate to each other. Our marginal cost curve, average total cost curve, and average variable cost curve. So marginal cost curve, average variable cost curve, and average total cost curve all at first fall, and then they'll rise. There's a clear distinction between these curves and our average fixed cost curve. Our average fixed cost curve is only falling. We're dividing a fixed number by an ever-increasing number of output, smaller and smaller and smaller. Finally, the last important point for this diagram is to note where does marginal cost intersect with average variable cost at its minimum, as well as average total cost, again at its minimum. Notice that these minimums do not perfectly align, that our average total cost curve minimum is slightly to the right of the minimum from our average variable cost curve. So there you have it, your short-run cost curves, your short-run cost equations, all in a nutshell. We should now be able to define fixed costs, variable costs, total costs, as well as our average costs and our marginal costs. And you also want to be able to distinguish between our total cost curves versus the average and marginal cost curves. We draw our total cost, total variable cost, and total fixed cost together, and then we can draw our marginal cost and our average variable cost together, as well as our average fixed costs. In the next video, we'll take a bigger look at the long run, where all of our inputs become variable.